The millionaire's son lost his voice on the day his mother died. The trauma locked him in a silence that the best doctors in the world couldn't break. The father, a man who could buy anything, couldn't buy back his son's voice. It was in this atmosphere of sadness that a simple Italian cleaning lady was hired. Then one day, the father heard a soft and familiar singing coming from the room. He ran, his heart tight, and the scene he found made him break down in tears. The cleaning lady was singing the same Italian opera that the boy's deceased mother used to sing to him to sleep. And the boy, for the first time in years, was singing along. The phone vibrated on the polished mahogany desk, an electronic dissonance in the quiet of an office that felt more like the sanctuary of a modern emperor. Arthur Belmont ignored it. On the panoramic screen that covered nearly an entire wall, green and red lines of market indices rose and fell, translating the pulse of the global financial market. Each flicker represented millions in his net worth, a constant flow of capital he conducted with the precision of a maestro. His empire had been built on the power of words, contracts, annual reports, risk analyses. He was a master of the language of numbers, an architect of fortunes who turned investments into a solid legacy. His dealings spanned continents with assets in equities, real estate investment trusts, and even cryptocurrency, a modern gamble that had yielded exponential profits. But the number flashing on his personal phone's caller ID was the one his vast fortune couldn't silence: his son's elite private school. With a sigh that carried the weight of an old defeat, he answered. The headmistress's voice, Mrs. Albright's, was, as always, crisp and formal, devoid of any warmth. She spoke of incidents, of a lack of engagement, of disruptive behavior. They were euphemisms for the truth they both knew. Leo, his 8-year-old son, heir to all this wealth, had had another meltdown. Ending the call, Arthur felt the familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He swiveled his leather chair away from the panel displaying his profitability in dollars and euros, and faced the single photograph on his desk. In it, his wife, Helena, was smiling, her arms around a 4-year-old Leo, a boy whose eyes shone with a seemingly infinite curiosity. Before a sudden illness took her, she had made him promise. Take care of our boy, Arthur. The world will be his, but first, he needs to learn how to read it. The promise now felt like an accusation. He had given Leo everything money could buy, the best tutors, the most renowned educational psychologists in the country, cutting-edge technology. Each of them, after weeks of frustrated attempts, delivered the same verdict veiled in complex jargon. The boy was a lost cause. For Leo, letters were a tangle of meaningless symbols, a barrier that isolated him in a world of frustration. His anger wasn't malice, it was desperation. His notebooks were a graveyard of broken pencils and torn pages, a silent testament to his daily struggle. At home, the silence was filled by Helena's absence and the noise of Arthur's own helplessness. The fortune he had amassed seemed like a cruel joke, a useless treasure in the face of the one thing that truly mattered. The last meeting with Mrs. Albright had been particularly humiliating. She had suggested, with calculated delicacy, that perhaps Leo would be better suited to an institution with specialized resources, away from the competitive environment of Belmont Academy, the very school Leo's own grandfather had helped to found. The irony was crushing. He, a billionaire whose influence shaped markets, was being gently invited to hide his son, to publicly admit his failure as a father. The phone vibrated again. It was Mrs. Albright once more. Arthur answered, his jaw tight, waiting for the final blow. "Mr. Belmont," she began in that same distant tone, "I've been thinking about our conversation, and while Leo's situation remains a significant challenge, I have a rather unorthodox proposal. This isn't about a new specialist." Arthur waited, his skepticism growing by the second. "I've noticed that the cleanliness of the classrooms, especially the art room where Leo spends so much of his time, has been subpar. This can affect the children's state of mind. I've found someone to help keep the environment impeccable. Her name is Elena." Arthur frowned, confused. "Mom, I don't understand. What does hiring a janitor have to do with my son's problem?" The pause on the other end of the line was deliberate, weighted with a meaning he couldn't decipher. "Just trust me, Mr. Belmont. Sometimes the solution lies in looking at the problem from a completely different perspective. Let Elena start tomorrow. I think you might be surprised." Elena arrived the next morning, promptly at 6, long before the first glimpse of sun gilded the wrought-iron gates of Belmont Academy. The building was a fortress of red brick and tradition, a place where the inheritance of great fortunes was molded for future generations. To her, it was just another job. She wore a simple blue uniform that contrasted with the silent opulence of marble corridors and hardwood lockers. Her hands, which in another life had guided brushes over canvas, now held a mop and a bucket. She didn't mind. There was a dignity in all honest work, a lesson learned through the hardships life had dealt her. Her first task was the art wing, a large, bright space with floor-to-ceiling windows. The smell of oil paint and fresh clay transported her to a time and place she rarely allowed herself to revisit. This was where Leo took refuge, and it was here that the chaos of his frustration became visible. There were crumpled papers on the floor, bits of broken crayons, and an overturned easel. Elena began her work with quiet method, moving with a grace that seemed to contradict her task. When Leo was dropped off in the room by his nanny an hour later, he barely noticed the woman cleaning in the corner. His shoulders were tense, his jaw set. He walked straight to his corner, a space the other students had learned to respect, and took out a large sketch pad. With a piece of charcoal, he began to draw. Elena continued her work, but her eyes, sharp and kind, watched his every move. She saw what the teachers and psychologists, with all their assessments and diagnoses, could not. They looked for words, for letters, for a linear logic that didn't exist in the boy's mind. Elena saw music. She saw rhythm. Leo's hand didn't tremble with anger, but with passion. He didn't draw objects, but their essence. A tree wasn't just a trunk and leaves. It was a tangle of force lines, the energy of life rising from the earth. A bird wasn't a feathered creature. It was the very concept of flight, freedom captured in a charcoal stroke. His notebooks, which the headmistress described as devoid of words, were in fact dictionaries of a complex and beautiful language. They were a record of his emotional assets, a portfolio of feelings he couldn't convert into common currency. The art teacher, Miss Dubois, a woman who believed more in technique than in expression, entered the room. "Leo, dear, we've talked about this. Where are your attempts at the letters of the day? We're working on A and B's." Leo ignored her, his hand moving faster across the paper, the charcoal leaving a dark, furious trail. The teacher sighed, a sound of restrained exasperation. "This is just a distraction, a coping mechanism. You need to apply yourself." She turned and only then seemed to notice Eleanor. "Oh, you must be the new janitor. Please make sure the floor under that boy's table is spotless. The amount of material he wastes is unbelievable." Eleanor just nodded, her gaze fixed on Leo's drawing. He had drawn a cage. Inside it, a frantic, blurred shape struggled, its lines so tight they nearly tore the paper. Elena felt her heart ache. She understood that image better than any pedagogical report. It was the boy's soul, imprisoned. At the end of her shift, when the room was empty and silent, Elena approached Leo's desk. The drawing of the cage was there, abandoned. Beside it, she saw the worksheet with the letters A and B that the teacher had left. Untouched, carefully, so as not to be seen by anyone, she took a small piece of clay from the supply cabinet. Swiftly, her skilled hands molded something. She didn't touch Leo's drawing or the worksheet. She just left the small clay sculpture beside them. It was a bird, its wings spread, ready for flight. She then left the room, her heart beating a little faster, not knowing if her small act of daring would cost her the job. The next day, Arthur dropped Leo off at the school's entrance with a heavy heart. The previous night's conversation had been the same as always, a monologue of anxious questions from him, met with the frustrated silence of his son. As his car pulled away, he took out his phone and checked his stock portfolio. Everything was up. The returns on his tech investments were astronomical, adding another layer to his already immense fortune. He was a rising billionaire, a name whispered with reverence in financial circles. But within these brick walls, he was just the father of a problem child. The feeling of powerlessness was a liability none of his assets could offset. He wondered if he should just liquidate part of his portfolio, maybe the gold or some higher-risk funds, and finance his own school, a place built around Leo's needs. But the idea died before it could bloom. Money built buildings. It hired people. But it couldn't buy understanding. He had already tried that and failed spectacularly. Meanwhile, in the art room, Leo approached his desk with the caution of an animal exploring new and potentially dangerous territory. His eyes immediately landed on the small clay figure, the bird. He stopped, his body rigid. It wasn't one of his. His first reaction was to recoil, a flicker of distrust. But then he looked closer. The wings were open, the head tilted slightly, as if it were about to sing. Slowly, he reached out and touched a wing with his fingertip. It was smooth, cool, and somehow comforting. He looked around. The room was nearly empty, except for the janitor, Elena, who was cleaning the windows on the far side, her back to him, seeming completely absorbed in her work. Leo picked up the clay bird and held it in the cup of his hands. It was perfect. Without hesitation, he tucked it into the deepest pocket of his backpack, a secret treasure. The worksheet with the letters A and B he pushed to the edge of the desk, where it eventually fluttered to the floor, forgotten. Elena felt the boy's gaze on her back but didn't turn. She could feel the tension in the room ease, like a violin string being slowly loosened. It was a small victory, but to her it felt as monumental as the dividends Arthur Belmont collected from his businesses. For the rest of the morning, she watched Leo from a distance. He was calmer, less agitated. He didn't draw his cage. Instead, he filled an entire page with dozens of birds of all shapes and sizes, flying across a vast, limitless sky. Near the end of the day, when most of the students had gone and Leo was waiting for his nanny, he did something he had never done before. He stood up and went to the large blackboard that covered an entire wall. With a piece of white chalk, he began to draw. Elena, who was collecting trash in the hallway, paused to watch through the partially open door. It wasn't a scribble, it was a masterpiece, a magnificent bird with a wingspan that took up nearly half the board, each feather detailed with stunning precision. When the nanny finally collected Leo, Eleanor entered the room to finish her cleaning. The drawing took her breath away. It was an answer, a communication, a thank you, spoken in the only language he commanded. Her heart hammered with a mix of joy and fear. She knew she was on dangerous ground, that Mrs. Albright was watching, but she couldn't stop. She picked up a piece of chalk, and beside Leo's masterpiece, she drew something, not an image, but a shape. She copied the contour of the bird's round head and body, creating the silhouette of the letter P. She didn't present it as an alphabet letter, but as an echo of his form, a symbol that connected to his world. She stepped back to admire the silent interplay on the blackboard, his art and her symbol side by side. At that moment, a shadow fell across the doorway. "Ma'am." Headmistress Albright's voice was like ice, cutting through the quiet room. Elena turned slowly, the chalk still in her hand, her heart sinking. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Albright's face was a mask of disapproval. Her eyes moved from Elena's drawing on the blackboard to the blue uniform she wore. a silent appraisal that said everything. Your function at this institution is to ensure cleanliness and order, Ms. Elena. Nothing more. Interacting with the students, and especially marking up school property, is far beyond your duties. The headmistress's voice was low, but every word was sharp. Eleanor felt a hot flush of embarrassment and indignation creep up her face. She clenched the chalk in her hand, her knuckles turning white. She wanted to explain, to say that this wasn't a doodle but a bridge, an attempt to reach a child everyone else had walled off, but the words wouldn't come. She knew that to the headmistress, she was invisible, an employee whose value was measured only by the efficiency of her hands in erasing messes, not in creating connections. Erase that immediately, Mrs. Albright commanded before turning and walking away, her heels clicking down the hall like hammer blows. With a heavy heart, Elena picked up the eraser. She hesitated for a moment, looking at the silent conversation she had started with Leo. To erase it felt like a betrayal, but the fear of losing her job, the only income that sustained her modest life, was stronger. The image of Leo's bird and the shape of her pea vanished under a cloud of chalk dust. The next morning, Leo entered the art room with an unusual sense of expectation. He went straight to the blackboard. It was clean, impeccably, antiseptically clean. The magnificent bird he had created was gone, and so was the curious shape beside it. A crease of confusion and disappointment formed on his brow. His shoulders slumped. The calm he had felt the day before began to dissipate, replaced by the familiar cloud of frustration. He glanced toward Elena, who was emptying the trash cans on the other side of the room, her face impassive. For an instant, their eyes met. Leo saw a flicker of something in her gaze, regret, sorrow, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He sat down at his desk, took out his sketchpad and charcoal, but the inspiration had left him. The page remained blank. Later, he saw Mrs. Albright reprimanding Eleanor in the hallway for something trivial, a smudge on a window. Elena's posture was submissive, her head bowed. The image cemented the hierarchy of the place in Leo's mind. The headmistress commanded, the janitor obeyed. The connection he'd felt had been an illusion. That evening, Arthur came home exhausted. A major deal involving a large cash flow projection and the acquisition of a tech startup had kept him in meetings all day. He expected to find Leo in his room, surrounded by expensive toys, but the nanny informed him he was in the backyard. Arthur found him sitting on the grass under the shade of an old oak tree. The boy wasn't playing. He was pulling up handfuls of grass with a silent ferocity. "Hey, champ," Arthur said, trying to keep his voice light. "Tough day at school?" Leo didn't answer. He just continued to destroy the immaculate lawn. Arthur sat down beside him. "Want to talk about it?" The silence was the only reply. Arthur felt the wall between them rise again. He thought of his inheritance, of all the assets that would one day be Leo's, an empire of numbers and contracts. What good would it all do if his own son couldn't even communicate with him? Frustration gnawed at him. He was a man accustomed to solving problems, to analyzing data and making decisions that generated millions in profit. But here, sitting on the grass next to his 8-year-old son, he was utterly incompetent. The next day, something shifted. When Elena entered the art room to begin her routine, she saw that Leo was already there, earlier than usual. He was at the blackboard again. His magnificent bird wasn't there. In its place, he had drawn a brilliant sun, its rays stretching across the entire surface. And then, Elena's heart leapt. Next to the sun, drawn with a slightly shaky but unmistakable hand, was a shape, a long, serpentine line that mimicked the form of one of the sun's rays, the letter S. He hadn't given up. He had understood their game. He was waiting for her next move. Ignoring the risk, ignoring the headmistress's warning, Elena felt a surge of courage. This boy was worth any risk. She checked the doorway to make sure she was alone, and then walked to the board. She didn't draw. Instead, she took a tub of yellow clay from the supply cabinet. She knelt on the floor, at a respectful distance from Leo, and began to work the clay in her hands. She wouldn't teach him to draw the next letter. She would teach him to feel it. Leo watched, motionless, as Elena's hands danced with the clay. There was no rush, no pressure. There was only the quiet transformation of a formless lump into something with meaning. She didn't look at him, didn't invite him to join. She just worked, her movements a tacit invitation. Slowly, as if testing the water, Leo knelt on the floor on the other side of the small work table Elena had improvised. He reached out a finger and touched the clay. Elena's gambit was an act of silent faith. She, who in her homeland had been an art teacher before life forced her down a different path, began to use her breaks not to rest, but to connect. She pushed a piece of clay toward him. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she gave him a small, encouraging smile. He took the clay. His hands, accustomed to breaking pencils in frustration, now moved with a hesitant delicacy. Elena took her own piece and slowly rolled it into two balls, one smaller and one larger, and joined them. Then, with her finger, she drew a straight line beside them. She pointed to the shape and then to an illustrated book open to a page showing a butterfly. Leo frowned, then his eyes widened. The letter B. He looked down at his own hands. With intense concentration, he began to mimic her movements. His first B was misshapen, but the second already had the suggestion of two bellies. She then took another piece and molded two mountains, side by side. The letter M. The tactile, visual world was finally connecting with the abstract. For the first time in years, Leo wasn't fighting the letters, he was building them. The art room door swung open, and Ms. Dubois entered. She stopped short, her mouth falling open in shock. The scene before her was bizarre. The school's most troubled student and the janitor, both kneeling on the floor, covered in clay. "What is going on in here?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "This is completely inappropriate. You are disrupting his development with this mess." Leo flinched, dropping the clay as if it had burned him. Elena rose slowly, subtly placing herself between the teacher and the boy. "I was just cleaning up a spill," she lied softly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Mr. Dubois didn't buy it. With a look of pure disdain, she marched out of the room, clearly on her way to the headmistress's office. Elena knew her time was running out. Arthur, in his skyscraper office, was finishing a conference call about the profitability of his European investment funds. The cash flow was positive. The compound interest was working in his favor, and his net worth had grown considerably this quarter. He felt a rare moment of satisfaction, a confirmation that his business empire was sound. It was then that his email pinged with a notification from Belmont Academy. The subject line read, "Urgent concern regarding Leo's behavior." His stomach plummeted. Mrs. Albright's message was brief and cold, speaking of inappropriate external interference and the need for a meeting to discuss, once again, the options for Leo. That brief moment of triumph evaporated, leaving only the bitter taste of failure. Back in the art room, the calm was shattered. Mrs. Albright entered, Mrs. Dubois at her heels. This time, there was no subtlety in her approach. "Miss Elena," she said, her voice cutting through the air, "I have already warned you about overstepping your duties. What Ms. Dubois has described to me is a direct violation of our policies and, frankly, an absurdity. You are not qualified to interact with our students. You are a janitor." Leo watched from his corner, his eyes wide with fear. He saw the kind woman who had shown him the mountains in the clay being humiliated, diminished. Elena stood tall, her head held high, though inside she was trembling. "With all due respect, ma'am, I was only trying to help." "Your help is neither solicited nor welcome," Mrs. Albright retorted. "This is your final warning. If I see you so much as look at a student again, you will be terminated immediately. No discussion. Am I clear? The threat hung in the air, heavy and final, as Leo held his breath, watching the only person who seemed to understand him about to be cast out of his world. The humiliation Elena endured resonated within the art room walls the next day. She moved with a caution that bordered on fear, feeling the eyes of Miss Dubois and Mrs. Albright on her every move. Even when they weren't there, each sweep of the broom, each wipe of a cloth, was executed with a robotic precision, devoid of the silent grace from before. She was an employee, nothing more. The bridge she had started to build to Leo was now under the watch of hostile guards, and any attempt to lay another stone could bring it all crashing down. Leo felt the shift the moment he walked in. The air, once charged with a secret promise, was now tense and cold. Elena didn't look his way. He didn't go to the blackboard or the clay cabinet. He sat at his desk, the silence between them heavier than any scolding. He understood, with the intuitive clarity of a child, that their connection had become dangerous. The clay bird was still in his backpack, a talisman whose power now seemed diminished. He watched Elena work, his heart aching to see her spontaneity replaced by a fearful rigidity. The woman who had taught him to feel the mountains in the letter M now barely dared to lift her eyes from the floor. On his way to the fateful meeting, Arthur felt the weight of his empire like an anchor. Stuck in traffic, he opened his investment app. Stocks were up, the value of his crypto wallet had soared, and dividends from his international holdings continued to flow, compounding a wealth that was already obscene. He was a multi-billionaire whose opinion could alter the course of major corporations, yet he was on his way to be reprimanded by a primary school headmistress. The irony was caustic. He thought about selling off a portion of his assets, perhaps creating a massive trust fund for Leo, as if money could somehow compensate for what was missing. But he knew it was useless. Helena would never have thought in terms of capital or net worth. She would have knelt on the floor, just as, according to the headmistress's email, the janitor had done. The image struck him with unexpected force. For the first time, he wondered about this woman, Elena. Who was she to risk her job for a child that wasn't hers? In the art room, time dragged on. Leo drew nothing. He just sat, watching Elena. At one point, she was cleaning near his desk. As she bent down to pick up a dropped piece of paper, something small and dark fell from her pocket and rolled near his foot. It was a move so quick and subtle that if he hadn't been paying complete attention, he would have missed it. Elena gave no sign. She just continued her work and moved away. Leo looked down at the floor. It was a small river stone, smooth and flat. With his foot, he nudged it under his desk. Minutes later, when he was sure no one was looking, he picked it up. The stone was warm from her body. He turned it over, and his heart leaped. On one side, scratched into the surface with something sharp, was the unmistakable shape of a key. On the other was the silhouette of a letter, a half circle attached to a straight back, the letter H for home. It was a message, a promise. I haven't given up. A wave of determination surged through Leo. He wasn't going to let them erase her. 20 minutes later, Arthur Belmont walked into the hushed halls of Belmont Academy. He was early for the meeting, his nervousness propelling him forward. The building felt deserted, most students having gone home. As he walked toward Mrs. Albright's office, a faint sound caught his attention. It came from down the hall, from the art wing. It was a soft, rhythmic click, 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 the sound of chalk on a blackboard. A curiosity mixed with an overwhelming premonition made him stop. He changed course, turning away from his destination and following the sound. The art room door was ajar. He approached silently, his heart pounding against his ribs. He didn't know what he expected to find. Perhaps his son in another fit of rage, destroying the board. Hesitantly, he peered through the crack in the door, bracing himself for the worst. The scene that met his eyes stole his breath, leaving him frozen on the threshold. Time seemed to stop. There, In the center of the room, flooded with the golden light of late afternoon, was Leo. Standing before the immense blackboard, he was not in crisis. He was calm, focused, holding himself with a sense of purpose Arthur had never seen. In his hand, he held a piece of chalk, and with it, he was tracing shapes on the dark surface. They weren't meaningless scribbles. They were words. Slowly, deliberately, he was writing. The key opens the home. The penmanship was childish, the letters uneven, but they were unmistakably legible. And beside each word, like a caption to an ancient hieroglyph, he had drawn a small pictogram, a tiny key next to key, a simple door next to opens, and the outline of a house with a triangular roof next to home. He was reading and writing in his own language, a fusion of image and symbol. Kneeling beside him, not touching him, not guiding him, but simply presentee was Elena. She wasn't teaching, she was witnessing. Her face was turned toward Leo, and on it was an expression of pride so pure and radiant it lit up the room. In that instant, Arthur Belmont's empire crumbled. All of his deals, his investments, his fortune in dollars and euros, seemed like dust. The wealth he commanded so skillfully had proven itself useless. Blind to the simple truth right in front of him, his son wasn't broken. He was brilliant. And he, the father, the tycoon, the market genius, had been the true illiterate, unable to read the soul of his own child. A silent, choked sob rose in his throat, an overwhelming mix of gratitude, shame, and a love so fierce it hurt. He didn't know how long he stood there, paralyzed, watching the sacred scene. It was the sound of brisk footsteps and the click of heels on the corridor floor that broke the trance. Mrs. Albright rounded the corner, her face set, ready for their meeting. She saw Arthur standing at the door, and her expression softened into a forced, professional smile. "Mr. Belmont, I'm so glad you're here. I was just on my way to my off—" Her words died as her gaze followed his into the room. Her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face. She saw Leo at the blackboard, saw the written sentence, and saw Eleanor kneeling beside him. The implication of what it meant hit her, followed by a wave of professional panic. Before she could form a word, before she could launch the accusation already on the tip of her tongue, Arthur took a step forward, blocking her view. He turned to face her, and the headmistress instinctively recoiled. The man before her was not the worried, somewhat defeated father she knew. His eyes, usually clouded with concern, now burned with a clarity and authority she had only ever seen on the covers of business magazines. He didn't raise his voice. When he spoke, it was in a low, calm tone, laced with irrefutable weight, the same tone he used to seal billion-dollar deals. "That woman," he said, nodding toward Elena, "is no longer the janitor." Mrs. Albright opened her mouth to protest, perhaps to say she was about to fire her anyway, but Arthur continued, giving her no chance. "As of today, she is the new director of this school's special education program." The headmistress gasped, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Mr. Belmont, that's impossible. She doesn't have the credentials, the experience. And as of today," Arthur cut in, the power in his voice silencing any objection, "I will be personally funding that program with a seed capital that would make this school's entire annual budget look like pocket change. And the first enrolled student, the model student whose progress will define the program's success, will be my son." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he delivered the final blow, looking directly into the eyes of the woman who had tried to cast out the only person who had saved his child. "Any objections, Director?" The silence that followed Mrs. Albright's hasty departure was louder than any argument. The headmistress had not answered Arthur's question. She didn't need to. The defeat in her eyes, quickly replaced by a simmering flame of fury, was a promise that this war was far from over. Only the battlefield had changed. In the art room, the air vibrated with the power of Arthur's declaration. He, Elena, and Leo remained like actors on a stage after an abrupt curtain fall. The adrenaline that had propelled Arthur began to recede, giving way to the enormity of what he had just done. He hadn't just challenged the school's authority, he had dynamited its foundations, using his vast capital as the explosive. He looked at Leo, who was in turn looking at the sentence on the blackboard with quiet pride. For the first time, Leo didn't look like an anomaly, a problem to be fixed. He looked like a pioneer, the discoverer of a new language. And then Arthur's gaze fell on Elena. She was still kneeling, but she seemed smaller now, as if the weight of the title he had bestowed upon her was crushing her. The woman who had operated with courage in the shadows was now thrust into the glaring spotlight of his fortune. Leo, sensing the complex current of adult emotions, broke the spell. He walked over to Arthur and, in a gesture of overwhelming simplicity, took his father's hand. It was the first time in months, perhaps years, that he had initiated physical contact out of something other than anger or need. The small hand that fit into his was the most powerful validation Arthur could have received. It was the dividend on an investment made not with money, but with faith. That simple touch was worth more than every share in his portfolio, more than the gold secured in vaults. He knelt, bringing himself to his son's level. "I am so proud of you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Leo just nodded, his eyes shining. He then turned and offered his other hand to Elena. Hesitantly, she took it, and there the three of them stood, holding hands, a triangle of hope in the wreckage of an old order. Arthur finally stood and addressed Elena. Words, his stock in trade, his means of building a business empire, now failed him. I don't know how to thank you," he began, his voice hoarse. "What you did, the best specialist, the most expensive, they all failed. You saw him." Elena got to her feet, dusting the chalk from her uniform with trembling hands. The look of pride she'd worn while watching Leo had been replaced by a deep apprehension. "Mr. Belmont," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I appreciate your words, but what you said to the headmistress, that's not possible. I am a janitor. I don't have degrees. I can't be a director." There was panic in her eyes. She didn't want to be the center of a firestorm. She had only wanted to help a boy find his voice. "Degrees?" Arthur almost laughed at the absurdity of the word. "I built a multi-billion-dollar portfolio on instinct, on seeing value where no one else did. You don't learn that in a university. What you have, Elena, can't be taught. You have wisdom. You didn't see a diagnosis. You saw my son." He took a step toward her, the intensity in his gaze stopping her from backing away. "And I can build an entire wing on this school. I can hire a staff to report to you. The resources, the money. That's not a problem. The only thing I can't buy is what you've already given him. Please, don't say no." He was pleading. The man who commanded boardrooms was now begging a woman who, an hour ago, was paid to clean up his son's mess. Elena looked from Arthur to Leo, who still held her hand tightly. The fear in her face warred with determination. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer that of a frightened victim, but of someone who understood the true value at stake. "I will consider your offer, Mr. Belmont." She paused, gathering her courage. "But I have one condition, and it has nothing to do with your money." Elena's condition hung in the air, instantly redefining the power dynamic between them. Arthur, the man accustomed to dictating the terms of any negotiation, found himself in the position of a listener, waiting for a verdict. He had expected a demand for security, perhaps a contract that would protect her from Mrs. Albright's inevitable retaliation. Instead, her condition disarmed him completely. "My condition," Elena said, her voice steady, "is that you come to the school every day for 1 hour, and you sit here in this room and you learn, not from me, from him." She nodded toward Leo. "You need to learn your son's language. You need to see the world as he sees it. No amount of your money, no special program you fund will ever replace that. What Leo needs most is not a benefactor, Mr. Belmont. He needs a father who understands him. The simplicity and depth of those words hit him like a physical blow. She wasn't asking for herself. She was asking for Leo, and without realizing it, for him too. She didn't see his fortune as the solution, but as part of the problem, the gilded wall that had separated him from his son. The first week of the new program was a lesson in humility for Arthur. Promptly at 3 p.m., he would leave his downtown office, postponing meetings on cash flow and asset acquisitions, and drive to Belmont Academy. He would sit in a chair that was too small for him in the back of the art room and watch. At first, it was excruciating. His instinct was to interfere, to optimize, to manage. He saw the slowness of the process, the repetition, and his executive mind screamed for efficiency. He wanted to hire more Elenas, create a method, scale the solution, but his promise kept him silent. Elena ignored his presence. She and Leo worked together in a world of their own. They used clay, paint, stones, leaves from the garden. They didn't learn the alphabet, they discovered it. The T was the strong trunk of a tree. The O was the shape of a surprised mouth. The V was a bird flying in the distance. Arthur watched as his son, the child who could barely meet his eye, now laughed freely, his hands stained with paint, his frustration replaced by creative joy. One afternoon, Elena gave Leo a large sheet of paper and several pots of colored paint. "I want you to show me what love looks like," she said softly. Arthur leaned forward, curious to see how his barely verbal son would render such an abstract concept. Leo didn't hesitate. He plunged his hands into the yellow paint and made a large circle in the center of the page, a sun. Then, with blue, he made waves around it. With green, grass below. But then he stopped. He looked over at Arthur, sitting in his corner. Leo walked over, took his father's hand, and led him to the red paint. Before Arthur could react, Leo pressed his father's paint-covered hand into the center of the yellow sun. He then placed his own smaller, red-painted hand right beside it, a large hand and a small one, together in the heart of his creation. Arthur looked at his stained hand and then at the image on the paper. A raw, powerful emotion seized him, and he had to look away so they wouldn't see him cry. Love, to Leo, was his father's hand in his. It was that simple. And he had almost missed it in his search for a cure money could buy. News of the Elena program spread through the school like wildfire. The teachers, loyal to Mrs. Albright, viewed it with skepticism and scorn. The parents, whose donations kept the school running, were intrigued by the daily presence of the billionaire Arthur Belmont in an art classroom. Mrs. Albright, for her part, watched from a distance, her fury on a low burn. She couldn't fire Elena, not with the threat of Arthur's funding withdrawal, but she could make her life impossible. Small acts of sabotage began. Art supplies would go missing. Schedules would be confused, causing other classes to need the room at the exact time Elena and Leo were using it. She was isolating Elena, treating her like an outcast, hoping the pressure would make her quit. But she underestimated Elena's resolve, and more importantly, she underestimated the transformation occurring in the man who signed the checks. Mrs. Albright's isolation tactic backfired. Instead of breaking Elena, it strengthened the bond between her, Arthur, and Leo, turning the art room into an island of resistance. Arthur, with his sharp eye for business strategy and tactics, recognized the war of attrition. He saw the headmistress trying to undermine Elena's resources, a subtle attack on her pedagogical assets. In response, he didn't confront her directly. Instead, he did what he would in a hostile takeover. He fortified his own position. He began arriving earlier for his sessions with Leo, bringing with him boxes of the highest quality art supplies, Italian clay, French pigments, handmade paper from Japan. They were gifts not just for Leo, but a silent message to the administration. You can create scarcity, but I am the source. My resources are infinite. He was using his net worth, not as a weapon, but as a shield to protect the sanctuary Eleanor had built. Elena, for her part, felt the growing attraction between herself and Arthur, an undercurrent as undeniable as the changing of seasons. It wasn't built on flirtation or sweet words, but on a mutual admiration forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. She saw him not as the billionaire the world knew, but as the vulnerable father learning to reconnect with his son. She saw the way his shoulders relaxed when he entered the room, how the worry crease in his brow softened as he watched Leo. Arthur, on the other hand, was captivated by her quiet strength. He, who was accustomed to women impressed by his wealth and status, found in Eleanor someone completely immune to it. Her value wasn't measured in dollars or euros, but in patience, wisdom, and an ability to see beauty where everyone else saw only flaws. He found himself watching her hands, how they could be so strong and gentle at once, molding clay and, metaphorically, his son's future. One day, a flashback hit Arthur like a rogue wave. He was watching Leo and Elena build a castle from blocks, each block bearing a different letter. Leo was laughing, trying to balance a Z on top of a wobbly tower. The scene transported him to an afternoon years ago. Helena, his late wife, was on the living room floor, building a pillow fort with a 3-year-old Leo. She was laughing in the same way, with that same total absorption in the moment. "You see, Arthur," she had said, looking up at him, "it's not about the fort, it's about building something together." The memory struck him with painful clarity. For years, he had focused on building an empire for Leo, a legacy of assets. But Helena, and now Eleanor, understood a deeper truth. The real legacy wasn't what he would leave for his son, but what he would build with him. The realization shook him. He had been so focused on his family's net worth that he had forgotten to invest in its emotional cash flow. The turning point in the Cold War with Mrs. Albright came from an unexpected source. Other parents, whose own children struggled with learning in lesser degrees, began to notice the transformation in Leo. The boy, once known for his tantrums, was now seen smiling in the hallways, occasionally showing a classmate one of his drawings or clay letter sculptures. Curiosity overcame loyalty to the headmistress. One mother, then two, then a small group, approached Arthur quietly during his daily hour at the school. They didn't want his money, they wanted his secret. They wanted to know what was happening in that art room that the best tutors couldn't replicate. Mrs. Albright, watching her power base erode, felt panic set in. She had tried to isolate Elena, but had instead created a movement, and at its center was a man whose influence she could no longer control. She needed a new strategy, one that would hit Elena not in her supplies, but in her credibility, in her past. Mrs. Albright's new strategy was cruel in its precision. Realizing she couldn't attack Elena directly without invoking Arthur's wrath, she began a subtle campaign of misinformation. Rumors started to circulate through the parent and faculty circles. Who was this Elena, really? Where did she come from? I heard she didn't even finish high school. Miss Dubois whispered in the teacher's lounge, just loud enough for several to hear. How can we trust a child's education to someone with no training? Questioned another. The headmistress planted seeds of doubt, playing on the elitism and fear that permeated the culture of Belmont Academy. The narrative was clear. Elena wasn't a gifted savior, but an unqualified fraud who had taken advantage of a rich, desperate father. She was tarnishing Elena's reputation, turning her humble past not into a story of resilience, but into proof of incompetence. Arthur heard the rumors. At first, he dismissed them as the petty poison of a bitter administrator. His business sense told him to ignore the noise and focus on results. And the results, Leo's happiness and progress, were undeniable. But he underestimated the power of doubt. One evening, while having dinner with Leo, his son asked a simple question that unsettled him. "Dad," he said, arranging the P's on his plate to form the letter E, "was Elena a teacher before?" The question was innocent, but Arthur realized he didn't know the answer. He knew nothing about Elena's life before she showed up at the academy in a blue uniform. He knew her value, but not her history. The seed of doubt, planted by the headmistress, found fertile ground in the part of his mind that was still ruled by logic and the need for credentials. He, who performed due diligence on any company before investing a single dollar, had handed the most precious thing in his life over to a complete stranger. Uncertainty, a feeling he loathed, began to eat at him. Arthur's internal conflict deepened. One part of him, the part that watched Leo read his first sentence, trusted Elena implicitly. It was a trust based on empirical evidence, on the emotional profits he saw every day. But the other part, the tycoon trained to assess risk and verify liabilities, was on high alert. What if the headmistress was right? What if Leo's improvement was a fluke? What if he was gambling his son's future on a feeling? The attraction he felt for her complicated things further. Were his feelings genuine, or were they just a form of gratitude? Was he falling for the woman, or for the cure she represented? These questions haunted him, creating a subtle distance between him and Elena during their sessions in the art room. He became more of an observer, less of a participant, his mind analyzing every interaction for confirmation or for a red flag. Elena felt the shift. The warmth in Arthur's presence had been replaced by a cautious formality. His looks were no longer ones of admiration, but of assessment. The sting of that mistrust was sharp. She, who had risked everything, who had made herself vulnerable for the sake of this boy, was now being examined under a microscope like one of his financial holdings. The pressure was coming from all sides. The staff's scorn, the parents' curious stares, and now, the doubt of the man she was beginning to love. One afternoon, after a particularly tense session where Arthur's silence was palpable, Elena made a decision. She couldn't go on like this. After Leo left with his nanny, she turned to Arthur, her heart pounding. "Mr. Belmont," she began, her voice quiet but laced with a contained emotion, "I know what they're saying about me, and I can see it's affecting you." She took a deep breath, preparing to leap into the abyss. "But I think it's time you knew the truth about who I am." The air in the art room grew thick, heavy with unspoken words. Arthur remained silent, his heart hammering against his ribs, a mixture of dread and hope vying for control. He, a man whose empire was built on the cold analysis of data and the mitigation of risk, was about to hear a truth that could not be quantified on any spreadsheet. Elena did not flinch under his searching gaze. Instead, she walked to her bag, hanging unobtrusively on a hook, and pulled out a worn wallet. With fingers that did not tremble, she opened it and removed 2 items. The first was a laminated ID card, old and faded. The second, a yellowed newspaper clipping, folded so many times the creases were nearly severed. She said nothing. She simply placed them on the work table between them. Arthur picked up the ID card. The photo was of a younger Eleanor, her face fuller, her eyes shining with a fierce optimism. Below the photo, in a language he didn't understand, was her name and a title: Founder and Pedagogical Director, the Sunflower School of Arts and Expression. He then picked up the newspaper clipping. There was a photo of Elena beaming, surrounded by a group of happy, messy children in front of a modest but vibrant building. Even without understanding the language, he could decipher the headline, which contained a universal word: miracle. "It was my school," Elena said, her voice soft but filled with an old pain. "In my home country. I built it from nothing, with help from the community. It was for children like Leo, children the system had written off, artists, dreamers, visual thinkers. We didn't teach with books, but with our hands, with music, with heart. It was my life, my fortune. She paused, swallowing hard. Then the crisis came. The country's economy collapsed. People lost everything. The families couldn't pay anymore. The government cut all the grants. I fought. I sold everything I owned to keep it open, but it wasn't enough. I lost it all. My business, my home, my purpose. I came here with what little I had left, hoping to start over. She looked down at her own hands. The only work I could find was this, dusting a world I once helped build somewhere else. A wave of shame so profound it nearly choked him washed over Arthur. The headmistress wasn't wrong. Elena didn't have the qualifications they valued. She had something infinitely more precious. Lived experience, proof of concept, human capital forged in passion and loss. He had doubted her. He, who prided himself on recognizing value where others didn't, had been blinded by the very prejudices he condemned. Eleanor, he started, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry. But before he could say more, the art room door burst open. Mrs. Albright stood there, her face flushed with triumphant fury. In her hand, she held a file. I knew it, she said, her voice vibrating with malicious pleasure, having clearly overheard the end of Elena's confession. I knew there was something wrong with you. She marched into the room, throwing the file onto the table. I made some calls. I checked your references. You don't have any, no qualifications, no degree recognized in this country. You lied on your application, omitting that your only professional experience was, she spat the word like poison, some charity school in a third world country that went bankrupt. She turned to Arthur, expecting solidarity. Mr. Belmont, you see now, she took advantage of you, of your desperation. She is a fraud who put your son at risk. Elena stood motionless, pale but holding her head high. Arthur looked from the headmistress to Elena, and in those few seconds, the most important decision of his life was made. Mrs. Albright, sensing victory, delivered the final blow. Miss Elena, on behalf of Belmont Academy and for the safety of our students, you are terminated. You have exhausted all your resources. Clean out your things and be off the property immediately. She then turned to Arthur with a smug smile. I'm sure you agree this is the only sensible course of action. Mrs. Albright's ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and final. She looked at Arthur, that smug smile fixed on her face, awaiting the confirmation that would validate her victory. But the man who faced her was not the tormented father she had manipulated for so long. He was Arthur Belmont, the magnate, the empire builder, the man whose gaze could make entire markets tremble. The calm on his face was more terrifying than any outburst of rage. He didn't glance at the file the headmistress had thrown on the table. He only had eyes for Eleanor, whose quiet dignity was a beacon in the poisoned room. He saw the newspaper clipping, the picture of her school, of the happy children, and he understood. She hadn't lost a business. She had lost a love. The bankruptcy the headmistress wielded as a weapon was, in fact, the scar of an honorable battle. He turned slowly to Mrs. Albright. You're right, Director, he said, his voice dangerously soft. This woman does not have the qualifications that this institution values. The headmistress beamed, relief and triumph plain in her eyes. But that, Arthur continued, is because this institution is fundamentally bankrupt. Not financially, of course. My checks and those of other parents ensure its cash flow, but it is bankrupt in its essence, in its vision, in its soul. The headmistress's smile faltered. Mr. Belmont, I don't think You see a piece of paper, Arthur interrupted, gesturing to the file, and call it a qualification. I see a child reading his first sentence and call it a result. You see a past in another country as a liability. I see it as an asset of incalculable value. You have just fired the most talented person to ever walk into this building. He picked up Elena's ID card and the newspaper clipping from the table. This woman didn't go bankrupt. She invested everything she had in children no one else wanted. She bet on humanity and lost to economics. There is no shame in that. The only shame here is your inability to recognize true wealth when it is standing right in front of you. He then turned to Elena, and the hardness in his face dissolved into something tender and full of awe. "You're not fired," he said with a finality that left no room for argument. "You're being promoted." He turned back to the headmistress, whose face had cycled from triumph to disbelief to horror. "I am withdrawing my funding from Belmont Academy, effective immediately. I'm going to use that capital and significantly more to help Elena rebuild what she lost. We are going to build a new school based on her principles, on her vision. And the Belmont name won't just be on the sign, it will be in every brick as proof of my commitment." The resolution of the conflicts was swift and decisive, like precise surgery. The news of Arthur Belmont's funding withdrawal, the Academy's largest benefactor, and the subsequent departure of several other influential parents who followed his lead, shook the institution to its foundations. Mrs. Albright was forced to resign by the Board of Trustees before the end of the week. The old order, built on rigidity and exclusion, had crumbled. For Arthur and Elena, the period that followed was a whirlwind of activity. But instead of analyzing stocks, Arthur was now analyzing architectural plans for the new school. Instead of calculating fund returns, he and Elena were calculating the number of children they could help. He wasn't just funding a project, he was co-building a dream. Their narrative arc found its climax not in a dramatic declaration of love, but in quiet moments of partnership. One evening, working late over the blueprints for the new Sunflower School, he simply reached for her hand. "Helena, my late wife, made me promise I'd teach Leo to read the world," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I failed. But you didn't just teach my son to read the world. You taught me how to read my own heart." Elena squeezed his hand, tears shining in her eyes. "And you, Arthur," she answered softly, "taught me how to rebuild mine." There were no more doubts, no more fear. There was only the serene certainty of two hearts that had found their home in each other. A year later, the morning sun illuminated a building that was the antithesis of Belmont Academy's brick fortress. The new Sunflower School was made of glass, light wood, and colorful walls, designed to be open, inviting, and full of light. In the front garden, instead of a bronze statue of a stern founder, there was an interactive sculpture made of recycled metal where children could hang their own artwork. The air hummed, not with the tense silence of discipline, but with the joyful buzz of creativity. At the center of it all was Leo. Now 9 years old, he was the school's unofficial tour guide. He led a group of new parents, confidently explaining how the music room used colors to teach notes and how the clay workshop was where words got bodies. He paused before a massive mural that covered an entire wall of the main hallway. It was a timeline, but told in pictures, symbols, and words. "And this is where I learned to read," he said, pointing to a drawing of a bird next to a P and a sun next to an S. He didn't speak of his old struggle with shame, but with the pride of an explorer who had mapped an unknown territory. Arthur watched from a distance, standing beside Elena. He wasn't wearing one of his expensive suits, but a casual shirt, and in his hands wasn't a smartphone displaying the stock market, but a small clay sculpture of the letter EA a student had given him. He had found a different kind of wealth, a portfolio of purpose that no compound interest could ever match. His investment in the Sunflower School had become the most profitable of his life, not in dollars, but in smiles, in breakthroughs, in rescued futures. The school wasn't just for children with learning difficulties, it was for all kinds of minds. It taught that there were many ways to be smart, many languages in which to communicate. The school-wide literacy it championed, as he had predicted, was its greatest achievement. Teachers from the old Belmont Academy, including a much-humbled Ms. Dubois, had applied for positions there, eager to learn the methods they once scorned. Arthur and Elena's relationship had bloomed into a quiet, profound love, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. He taught her about the world of business, helping her establish an endowment to ensure the school would never face financial hardship again. She, in turn, taught him to pause, to breathe, to find joy not in the acquisition, but in the process. That afternoon, after the parent tour, the three of them, Arthur, Elena, and Leo, walked hand in hand through the school's garden. Leo chatted about a new project, writing and illustrating his own book. "It's about a boy who thinks in pictures," he explained, "and a janitor who was really a queen in disguise, and a king who forgot how to laugh." Arthur and Elena shared a knowing smile over the boy's head. The transformation was complete. The scene that had frozen him in the art room doorway hadn't been a miracle, but the start of a journey. It was proof that sometimes the deepest wisdom isn't found in expensive degrees or annual reports, but in the hands willing to wipe away the dust to reveal the treasure underneath. The true legacy he would leave his son would not be an empire of assets, but the lesson that the greatest asset of all is a heart that knows how to read and understand another's. And that was a fortune that could never be lost.